Isaac Drummond's thermometer showed 35 degrees below zero, and even with flames devouring cord after cord of precious firewood, frost still formed on the inside walls of his cabin. A stone's throw away, Tobias Carver sat comfortably in light clothing beside barely glowing embers, his peculiar stone wall releasing hours of stored warmth into the small room. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1836 arrived early in the Montana Territory with a cruelty that veteran trappers would remember for years. Tobias Carver had survived 4 winters in the mountains by that point, trapping beaver along the tributaries feeding into the Yellowstone River. He considered himself competent, careful, and reasonably prepared for whatever the wilderness could deliver. He was wrong about that last part. Tobias had partnered that season with William Marsh, a Pennsylvania trapper who had come west 3 years earlier. They built their cabin in late September using standard methods every mountain man knew: logs notched at corners, moss and mud chinked between gaps, one sturdy door, a small window covered with oiled paper, and a stone fireplace. The cabin took 6 days to complete, and both men felt confident they had adequate shelter for the coming cold. The first serious cold arrived in early November. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero and stayed there for a week. Inside the cabin, Tobias and William kept a fire burning constantly, consuming wood at an alarming rate. Every 4 hours someone had to venture into the bitter cold for more logs. The fire seemed to devour fuel without producing proportional warmth. Stand directly beside the flames, and you could be comfortable. Move 6 feet away, and cold pressed against you like something physical and malicious. William began having trouble with his hands during the 3rd week of sustained cold. His fingers felt numb even when held near the fire. Tobias examined them by firelight and saw telltale white patches of frostbite forming on William's left-hand fingertips. They tried everything. William kept his hands wrapped in wool near the fire constantly, tucked under his arms while sleeping. Nothing stopped the progression. By December, the frostbite had worsened. William could no longer feel his left thumb and index finger. The skin had turned dark and mottled. They discussed whether William should leave immediately for a trading post, but deep snow and extreme cold made travel suicidal. The cold persisted through December and into January, with only brief respites. Tobias became obsessed with keeping the fire large and hot, cutting and hauling wood with desperate intensity. The cabin was never truly warm. Even standing beside the roaring fire, cold air pressed against his back. The walls offered no insulation. Heat escaped through. Gaps between logs and rose through the roof faster than the fire could generate it. When spring finally arrived in late March, William's left hand had lost 2 fingers completely. Tobias helped William perform the grim amputation using a heated knife and whiskey. William survived, but his trapping career was finished. A man needed both hands functional to set traps and process pelts. William left the mountains in April, heading east with enough money to start over. After William disappeared down the trail, Tobias stood outside the cabin and looked at the structure with new eyes. The cabin hadn't protected them. William had lost fingers while sitting inside next to a roaring fire, doing everything possible to stay warm. Something was fundamentally wrong with how mountain cabins were built, and Tobias could not stop thinking about it. Spring arrived slowly in the high country, revealing a landscape scarred by months of brutal cold. Tobias remained at the cabin alone through April and into May, processing the last of the season's pelts and preparing for the journey to St. Louis. But the work was mechanical, performed without real attention. His mind circled endlessly around a single question that William's maimed hand had burned into his consciousness. Why had the cabin failed so completely to hold heat? The fireplace needed repairs after the winter's constant use. Mortar had cracked in several places where intense heat had stressed the stonework. Tobias spent 3 days rebuilding sections of the firebox, carefully fitting new stones and mixing fresh mortar from clay. He dug near the creek. The work was familiar and allowed his hands to stay busy while his mind worked on the larger problem. During this repair work, Tobias noticed something that would change everything. He had rebuilt a section of the fireplace in the morning, using stones heated near the fire to drive out moisture before mortaring them. By evening, after letting the fire die to coals, those new stones were still noticeably warm to the touch. He pressed his palm against them and felt heat radiating into his hand. The wooden walls of the cabin had gone cold within an hour of the fire diminishing. Tobias began simple experiments that would have seemed strange to anyone watching. He built the fire hot in the morning, then let it die completely by afternoon. Every hour he touched different surfaces throughout the cabin. The log walls went cold quickly, retaining almost no warmth once the fire stopped. The stone fireplace stayed warm for hours. 8 hours after the fire had gone out completely, the stones near the firebox still held enough heat that Tobias could warm his hands against them. He expanded his observations. The foundation stones under the cabin, exposed to the fire's heat through gaps in the floorboards, retained warmth even longer. Tobias would check them late at night, 10 or 12 hours after the fire had burned down, and find them still holding noticeable heat. Wood released heat almost immediately. Stone absorbed it and gave it back slowly over many hours. The contrast became impossible to ignore. The cabin's wooden walls did almost nothing to hold heat inside. They blocked wind, but had no capacity to store thermal energy. The small amount of stone in the fireplace acted like a reservoir of warmth that continued providing heat long after the fire died. The mathematics seemed obvious once Tobias understood the principle. A cabin made mostly of wood would always lose heat rapidly. A cabin with more stone might hold warmth the way the fireplace stones did. An idea was forming in Tobias's mind that seemed radical and possibly insane. What if a cabin could be built with stone making up a significant portion of the walls, not just the fireplace, but an entire wall of stone that could absorb heat from the sun during the day and from the fire inside during the night? The thermal mass would be enormous, storing enough heat to keep the interior warm for hours without requiring a constantly burning fire. Summer brought traffic to the mountains as trappers, traders, and adventurers moved through the high country during the brief season of navigable trails. Tobias used this opportunity to visit every camp, cabin, and settlement within a week's travel, studying construction methods with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. He was no longer just a trapper. He had become a student of shelter, heat, and survival, though few understood what drove his strange behavior. He traveled first to a trading post 60 miles south, a substantial structure built 5 years earlier by a company outfit. The building featured stone walls rising 4 feet above ground before transitioning to log construction above. Tobias spent 2 days there, ostensibly trading supplies, but actually studying the stonework and asking questions that puzzled the traders. How warm did the building stay in winter? Did the stone walls help? How thick were they? The head trader, a practical man named Peter Holcomb, who had spent 20 years on the frontier, initially dismissed Tobias's questions as idle curiosity. But when Tobias kept pressing for details, asking about mortar composition, stone selection, and thermal performance, Peter's attitude shifted. He recognized genuine interest, the kind that came from necessity rather than casual wondering. Peter told Tobias that the stone foundation walls made a remarkable difference in winter. The lower 4 feet of the building stayed noticeably warmer than structures built entirely of wood, and the stone seemed to moderate temperature swings throughout the day and night. Tobias asked whether anyone had ever built a structure with entire walls of stone. Peter mentioned buildings back east in Pennsylvania and New York where stone construction was common: full stone houses, stone barns, even stone fences. But out here on the frontier, nobody bothered. Stone construction required enormous labor, specialized knowledge, and access to good building stone. Logs were everywhere, easily worked, and adequate for most purposes. Why spend months hauling and fitting stones when you could build a serviceable cabin in less than a week? That question followed Tobias through the rest of the summer as he continued his investigation. He visited 7 different trapper camps, examining their cabins, touching their walls, asking about winter heating. Most trappers thought his behavior was peculiar but harmless. Isaac Drummond, who encountered Tobias at a creek rendezvous in late July, started calling him Carver the Stone Counter after watching Tobias spend an hour examining the rock foundation of an abandoned cabin. The nickname spread quickly through the small trapping community. Men who had known Tobias as a competent, unremarkable trapper now saw him as someone slightly unbalanced. He collected stones from creek beds, weighing them in his hands, studying their shapes. He sketched designs in the dirt with a stick, drawing walls and calculating proportions that made no sense to observers. He talked about thermal mass and heat retention using terms most mountain men had never heard. By August, Tobias had developed a clear vision that he shared with no one because he knew how it would sound. He would build a cabin with an entire wall made of stone, a massive thermal battery that could store heat from both sun and fire, radiating warmth for hours after both sources diminished. The other trappers could mock him all they wanted. William Marsh's ruined hand was proof enough that standard methods were inadequate. Tobias returned to his trapping territory in late August with a plan that would consume the entire fall season. Most trappers spent these months preparing trap lines, scouting beaver colonies, and stockpiling supplies for winter trapping. Tobias spent them wading through creeks, collecting stones. The decision effectively sacrificed his fall trapping income, but William Marsh's mutilated hand haunted him more than the prospect of a lean year. He started in the creek nearest his cabin site, a clear tributary that ran fast and cold down from the high peaks. Thousands of river stones lined the streambed, smoothed by centuries of water flow into rounded, oval shapes. Tobias developed selection criteria that seemed arbitrary to anyone watching, but made perfect sense to him. Each stone needed to be roughly the size of his 2 fists together, smooth without sharp edges, dense and heavy for its size, and uniform enough in shape to stack tightly against others. He rejected hundreds of stones for every one he kept. Too irregular, and it would create gaps that weakened the wall's thermal mass. Too flat, and it wouldn't stack properly. Too light, and it likely contained air pockets that reduced heat storage capacity. Tobias wanted dense river stones that had weight and substance, the kind that would absorb maximum thermal energy and release it slowly over many hours. The physical labor was brutal. Each stone weighed between 10 and 20 pounds. Tobias would wade into the creek, select suitable stones, and carry them to the bank, where he loaded them onto a travois he had constructed from saplings and hide. His horse pulled the loaded travois back to the building site, a quarter-mile from the creek. Unload, return, repeat. Some days he made 8 trips. Some days 12. The pile of stones beside his chosen cabin site grew slowly but steadily. Isaac Drummond rode by in mid-September and stopped to watch Tobias working in the creek. "Building a fort, Carver?" Isaac called out with obvious amusement. "Planning to fight off the whole Blackfoot Nation with a pile of rocks?" Tobias didn't respond, just continued selecting and loading stones. Isaac watched for a few more minutes, shook his head, and rode on. That evening around campfires, Isaac told other trappers about Carver's stone collection. The story spread with embellishments. Some said Tobias had gone simple from too many winters alone. Others suggested he was building some kind of monument or marker. Nobody guessed the truth. By late October, Tobias had collected over 2 tons of river stone. The pile stood 5 feet high and 12 feet across, representing 3 months of daily labor. His hands were permanently roughened from handling wet stones. His back ached constantly. His financial situation had deteriorated because he had trapped almost nothing during the prime fall season. Other trappers had secured their winter supplies and income. Tobias had a mountain of rocks and a vision nobody else could see. Winter was 6 weeks away, and he had not yet laid a single log or stone for his cabin. The real work was just beginning. November arrived with the first serious snowfall, and Tobias began construction with winter breathing down his neck. Every experienced trapper knew you needed shelter completed before deep cold arrived. Tobias was attempting something unprecedented with 6 weeks until conditions became potentially lethal. The pressure would have paralyzed most men. It focused Tobias with absolute clarity. The first challenge was foundation. Standard cabins sat directly on the ground or on simple log sills that rotted within years. Tobias needed something that could support thousands of pounds of stone without settling or shifting. He spent 4 days digging and placing foundation piers using the largest flat stones from his collection. Each pier went down 2 feet into the earth below the frost line, then rose 18 inches above ground level. He positioned 8 piers in a rectangular pattern, spacing them to distribute the massive weight his stone wall would create. Across these piers he laid thick sill logs he had cut and shaped during the stone collection months. The sills formed a level platform elevated above the snow line and provided anchor points for the vertical framework he would build next. Other trappers built directly on earth. Tobias was engineering a structure that would carry loads no mountain cabin had ever supported. The framework design had consumed his thoughts for months. He needed vertical beams strong enough to contain tons of stone, but spaced to allow the stones to form a solid thermal mass. Too wide, and the stones might shift. Too narrow, and he would waste timber and create unnecessary barriers to heat transfer. He settled on spacing the vertical beams 18 inches apart, creating cells that would hold stones in organized columns while maintaining structural integrity. He selected 8 straight pine trees for the vertical beams, each approximately 8 inches in diameter. He felled them, stripped them, and shaped them into uniform posts 12 feet long. These would run from the foundation sills to the roof line, creating the skeleton that would hold his stone wall. Each post was notched at top and bottom to lock into the sill logs below and the header beam above. Raising the posts required precision and improvisation. Tobias worked alone, using a tripod and pulley system he constructed from salvaged rope and shaped poles. Each vertical beam had to be perfectly plumb, checked, and rechecked with a weighted string. A leaning post would concentrate weight improperly and could lead to catastrophic failure once the stones were added. He spent an entire day positioning just the first post, testing it from every angle before securing it permanently. The header beam presented the greatest engineering challenge. This single timber would span the top of all vertical posts, connecting them and distributing the roof's weight across the entire framework. Tobias selected the largest, straightest log he had cut, nearly 14 inches in diameter and 16 feet long. It took him 2 days to maneuver it into position using his pulley system and temporary bracing. When finally secured, notched into each vertical post, the header beam transformed separate posts into an integrated structure. The framework stood complete, pale timber against gray November sky, waiting for the stones that would test whether Tobias's vision was genius or fatal miscalculation. The completed framework stood stark against the November landscape, pale timber posts rising from foundation to roofline in perfect vertical alignment. To Tobias, it represented months of calculation and careful engineering. To every trapper who saw it, the structure looked fragile and doomed. Isaac Drummond rode by on a cold morning in mid-November and stopped to examine the construction with unconcealed skepticism. "Those posts won't hold rock weight, Carver," Isaac called out. You're building a structure that'll collapse before spring." He dismounted and walked closer, running his hand along one of the vertical beams. 8-inch posts? You're planning to stack stone between these? Isaac shook his head slowly. "I've seen barn roofs collapse with less weight than you're planning. This is madness." Tobias continued working on the side wall logs, traditional horizontal construction that would form the cabin's other 3 walls. He had already notched and stacked 6 courses of logs, creating the standard structure everyone recognized. The contrast between the conventional log walls and the experimental stone gable framework made the project look even more bizarre. 3 walls of familiar construction, 1 wall of untested innovation. "I'll bet you $10 that wall comes down before February," Isaac said, warming to his topic. Several other trappers had ridden up during the conversation, attracted by Isaac's loud voice. "Any man here willing to wager Carver's rock pile stays standing through winter?" 2 trappers took the bet immediately. Nobody wagered in Tobias's favor. The audience didn't bother Tobias. He had expected mockery, and had already endured months of it during the stone collection phase. Words couldn't hurt him. Freezing to death could. Losing fingers like William could. Building another inadequate cabin that failed to protect him could. The framework would hold or it wouldn't. But Tobias had calculated the load distribution carefully, and he trusted his engineering more than he trusted the conventional wisdom of men who had never attempted anything beyond standard construction. He finished the side walls first, bringing them up to meet the header beam of the stone wall framework. The integration required precise notching where the horizontal logs met the vertical posts. Each connection had to be solid because the side walls would help brace the framework against lateral forces once the stone weight was added. Tobias cut each notch carefully, testing the fit multiple times before finalizing it. The roof structure came next. He laid rafters across from the side walls to the header beam, creating a simple gable roof that would shed snow efficiently. The rafters were substantial timber necessary to support the snow load these mountains produced. He covered the rafters with split planks, then layers of bark, then sod. The roof added significant weight to the structure, but the framework held steady. By late November, the cabin was complete except for the stone wall filling. The framework stood ready, vertical posts creating 8 cells, waiting to be packed with river stones. Snow fell steadily now. Temperature dropped below 0 at night. Tobias had perhaps 3 weeks before conditions became too severe for the detailed work of stone placement. He began filling the cells the next morning, starting at the foundation and working upward systematically. The work of placing stones was methodical, physically demanding, and absolutely critical to the entire design. Tobias started at the foundation level, selecting the largest, heaviest stones from his collected pile. These would bear the weight of everything above, and they needed to be positioned with care. Each stone was lifted, tested for fit, adjusted, and settled into place with deliberate precision. The vertical posts created 8 cells, each 18 inches wide and extending from foundation to roofline. Tobias filled them 1 layer at a time, working across all 8 cells before moving higher. This approach distributed weight evenly and allowed him to monitor how the framework responded to increasing load. After the first layer, he checked every post for plumb. They remained perfectly vertical. After the second layer, he checked again, still solid. The stone placement followed patterns Tobias had worked out during his months of planning. Larger stones formed the outer edges of each cell, creating visible structure. Smaller stones filled the interior spaces, packed tightly to eliminate air gaps that would reduce thermal mass. The goal was maximum density, the most stone per cubic foot possible, because every pound of rock represented additional heat storage capacity. The work was backbreaking. Lift a 20-pound stone from the pile, carry it to the wall, climb the ladder he had positioned against the framework, position the stone carefully, climb down, repeat. Some stones fit perfectly on the first attempt. Others required adjustment, removal, repositioning. Tobias rejected stones that didn't fit properly, returning them to the pile, rather than compromising the wall's integrity. The framework performed exactly as designed. The vertical posts showed no signs of stress, even as the weight increased. The header beam remained level and solid. The integration points where sidewall logs met the framework stayed tight and secure. Tobias had calculated correctly. The structure was handling loads that would have crushed standard cabin construction. By early December, the cells were filled to 6 feet high, roughly halfway to the roof line. The wall was already impressive. A mosaic of rounded river stones contained within pale timber framework. The visual effect was unlike anything in the region. Smooth oval stones packed together in organized vertical columns, the framework visible as clean lines dividing the stone masses into geometric sections. Daniel Ashford visited during this phase and stood silently studying the wall for several minutes before speaking. "I've never seen anything like this, Tobias," he said quietly. "Is it going to work?" Tobias paused in his work and considered the question seriously. "The stones will hold heat," he replied. "The framework is supporting the weight. Whether it works well enough to matter, I'll know when winter truly arrives." As the wall rose higher, Tobias added an unexpected element. At the base of the stone wall, extending its full width, he constructed a narrow wooden platform. The platform sat 18 inches above the snow line, supported by short posts anchored to the foundation piers. To observers, it made no sense. A platform with no door access, no obvious purpose, built with precious lumber in a season when every resource mattered. But Tobias had a reason for everything he built, even if he kept those reasons to himself. The stone wall reached completion on December 18, 1836. The final stones fit into place at the peak of the gable, completing a structure that rose 12 feet from foundation to roofline. Tobias stepped back and examined his work with the critical eye of someone who understood that his survival depended on the quality of what he had built. The wall contained over 2 tons of river stone held within a framework of vertical timber posts, all integrated with traditional log construction on the other 3 sides. The visual impact was immediate and jarring. Every cabin in the territory looked essentially the same, variations on a theme of horizontal logs and simple construction. Tobias's cabin featured a massive stone facade that dominated the structure's appearance. The contrast between the weathered logs of the sidewalls and the pale framework filled with dark river stones made the building look like 2 different structures merged together through some strange necessity. News of the completion spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. Men rode out of their way to see what Carver had built, and their reactions ranged from puzzlement to open mockery. The most common comment was that Tobias had wasted an entire season building a monument to his own foolishness. Isaac Drummond brought 3 other trappers to view the structure and spent an hour pointing out everything he considered flawed or doomed to failure. "That platform makes no sense whatsoever," Isaac declared, gesturing at the narrow wooden deck Tobias had built at the base of the stone wall. "No door, no steps leading anywhere, just wasted lumber attached to a rock pile. And those vertical posts, they're already showing stress cracks from the weight." Tobias examined the posts Isaac indicated and saw no cracks at all, but he didn't argue. The structure would prove itself, or it wouldn't. The nickname Bridger's Rock Pile emerged during this period, though Tobias's last name was Carver. Someone confused him with the famous mountain man Jim Bridger, and the name stuck despite being factually wrong. Within 2 weeks, trappers throughout the region referred to the cabin as either Bridger's Rock Pile or Carver's Folly, depending on their degree of skepticism. Tobias moved his supplies into the completed cabin during the last week of December. He arranged his sleeping platform, organized his trapping equipment, and stocked food supplies for winter. He positioned his fireplace tools and stacked a modest amount of firewood inside, far less than any other trapper would consider adequate. Isaac noticed the small wood pile during a visit and laughed outright. "You'll freeze before January ends with that amount of fuel," he predicted. The first serious cold snap arrived on January 2nd. Temperature dropped to 15 below zero overnight and continued falling. Tobias lit a small fire in his fireplace. Nothing like the roaring blazes he had maintained the previous winter. The fire burned quietly, consuming wood slowly while Tobias prepared his evening meal. Outside, other trappers were feeding large fires desperately. Inside Tobias's cabin, the stone wall began absorbing heat from both the interior fire and the weak winter sunlight that had struck it during the short day. The real test was beginning. The severe cold snap that arrived in mid-January 1837 became the benchmark against which all subsequent winters were measured. Temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero and stayed there for 6 consecutive days. Trappers throughout the region burned through their wood supplies at catastrophic rates, and several men abandoned their cabins entirely, riding to lower elevations or trading posts where conditions were marginally more survivable. Isaac Drummond's cabin, 50 yards from Tobias's structure, became a reference point for comparison. Isaac maintained a fire that consumed a full cord of wood every 3 days, feeding logs constantly in a desperate effort to maintain livable temperature. Despite this effort, frost formed on the interior walls. Water left in a cup overnight froze solid. Isaac slept in every layer of clothing he owned and still shivered through the nights. On the 4th day of extreme cold, Daniel Ashford rode through the area checking on isolated trappers. He stopped at Isaac's cabin first and found Isaac hollow-eyed and exhausted from the constant effort of fire maintenance. "How's Carver doing?" Daniel asked. "Haven't seen smoke from his chimney, like I'd expect in this cold." Isaac admitted he hadn't checked, assuming Tobias was either dead or had abandoned the cabin. They rode together to Tobias's structure, expecting to find it dark and empty. Instead, they found thin smoke rising from the chimney, and Tobias visible through the window, sitting at his table in his shirt-sleeves, reading a book by candlelight. The fire in his fireplace was barely more than glowing coals. Daniel and Isaac stared through the window in disbelief before Daniel dismounted and knocked on the door. Tobias opened the door, and a wave of warm air flowed out into the brutal cold. "Come in," Tobias said simply. Daniel and Isaac entered and stood just inside the door, feeling warmth that seemed impossible, given the minimal fire and extreme exterior temperature. The stone wall radiated heat like something alive. Daniel walked to the wall and pressed his palm against it. The stones were warm to the touch, releasing stored thermal energy accumulated during the previous day and from the small fire. "I need to measure this," Daniel said. He returned to his horse and retrieved a thermometer he carried for recording weather observations. He hung it inside Isaac's cabin first, letting it stabilize for 10 minutes. The reading showed 19 degrees below zero, despite the massive fire Isaac had burning. Then Daniel brought the thermometer to Tobias's cabin and repeated the process. The reading stabilized at 10 degrees above zero, 29 degrees difference. The measurement was precise and undeniable. Tobias's cabin, with a fire that consumed 1/4 the wood of Isaac's, maintained an interior temperature 29 degrees warmer. The stone wall was performing exactly as Tobias had calculated. It absorbed heat during any period when exterior or interior temperature exceeded the stone's current temperature, then released that stored energy slowly over many hours. Isaac stood in the warm cabin, looking at the thermometer, then at the stone wall, then at Tobias. "I was wrong," Isaac said quietly. "This isn't madness. This is the smartest thing any of us has ever built." Word of the 29-degree difference spread through the trapping community within 2 weeks, carried by men who had witnessed the measurement themselves. The winter of 1837 passed with Tobias living in comfort that seemed miraculous to men still struggling in standard cabins. He burned less than half the firewood of his neighbors, maintained consistent warmth regardless of exterior temperature, and never experienced the desperate cold that had cost William Marsh his fingers the previous year. The stone wall performed flawlessly, absorbing solar heat during brief winter days and radiating stored warmth through long nights. Word spread slowly through the scattered trapping community. Men who had mocked the construction now asked detailed questions about technique, materials, and engineering principles. Tobias shared his knowledge freely with anyone interested enough to listen. He explained thermal mass, heat absorption rates, framework design, and foundation requirements. Most trappers listened politely, but never attempted replication. The labor investment seemed impossible to men accustomed to building adequate shelter in less than a week. A few took the knowledge seriously. Daniel Ashford began collecting river stones the following summer, planning his own stonewall cabin for the next building season. Peter Holcomb, the trading post operator, incorporated stone thermal mass principles into an addition he built in 1838. 3 other trappers, whose names history did not preserve, attempted variations of the technique with mixed results. The principle was sound, but execution required precision and commitment most men couldn't sustain. By 1840, perhaps 6 stone wall cabins existed across the northern Rockies, each one a testimony to patience and engineering over conventional speed. These structures became known for their warmth and efficiency. Trappers caught in severe weather would detour significant distances to reach a stone wall cabin, knowing the shelter offered genuine protection rather than minimal survival. The phrase, "warm as Carver's Place," entered the regional vocabulary, though most men still called the original structure Bridger's Rock Pile. Despite the factual error, the Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed in the early 1840s as beaver populations declined and silk replaced felt in hat manufacturing. Trappers abandoned the mountains in large numbers, heading to Oregon, California, or back to civilization. Tobias left in 1844, selling his cabin and trap lines to a younger man just arriving in the territory. He invested his savings in a ranch near the Willamette Valley in Oregon, married a widow with 2 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1868. But the cabin remained. The new owner maintained it, recognizing its superior design. Subsequent occupants valued the warmth and efficiency. The structure stood solid through decades, the stone wall and framework showing no deterioration, while conventional cabins around it rotted and collapsed. Travelers in the 1850s and 60s mentioned the unusual stone-faced cabin in journals and letters, often noting its reputation for warmth. The legacy wasn't fame or fortune. Tobias never profited from his innovation beyond his own survival and comfort. But in the high country where cold could kill, as certainly as any predator, a handful of men built cabins using principles one obsessive trapper had proven through calculation, labor, and physics. Some innovations spread through dramatic publicity. This one spread through quiet demonstration that a better way was possible for those willing to attempt it.